Good afternoon and welcome to the fifth plenary session. I trust all of you had a good lunch and perhaps to break the tendency to sleep, let me just start this session with a story which are all familiar with. It's the story of the three little pigs. You familiar with that? The first one built a house made of straw. Let's use plastic soda straw. Okay. The second one built the house with styrofoam and balsa wood. And of course, the third built the house with brick, with the help of Habitat, I suppose. So, as we all know the story, disaster came in the form of the wolf. By huffing and puffing, the house made of straw collapsed, and the poor resident had to evacuate and was relocated to the house made of styrofoam and balsa wood. But again, the huffing and puffing wolf came again, and again the two had to evacuate, and they went to a habitat community, okay, made of bricks. Well, I guess this story would more or less capture the essence of this afternoon session. We are talking about disaster risk reduction and management. And how does Habitat relate to this issue? I guess there are 3 or 4 S's that Habitat is looking into. First is site. Where do you locate them? Then the shelter. What kind of shelter will you provide them? Then, of course, security and safety. So with that analogy, I would like to start the session. And in the Philippines, where women are held on a pedestal, we would like to start with the ladies first. So let me introduce, we have 3 ladies and 3 gentlemen. And our panelists actually represent, I would say, 6 different areas of concern or discipline. You have legislation, you have governance, you have social work, you have relief, rehabilitation, and last but not least, and very important, information or communication. So without further ado, I would like to request first, our first speaker who I introduce is really a TV personality by heart, and she believes in the power of the video. So we will start this with a short video material, which she prepared specially for this afternoon's session. Roll video, please. Well, a picture says 1,000 words, and that short video said 1,000,000 words. So on that note, I would like to introduce our first speaker. We have, of course, a well-known personality in Philippine media and in Philippine politics. She is an advocate for the environment, a strong supporter of women and child rights, of course, a legislator, and I would say still a TV personality by heart. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Senator Loren Legarda.
Good afternoon. Am I given my 2 minutes now? Oh, thank you very much,
Make it
Rod.
3.
Yes. Well, I assume that not all of you in this room today are Filipinos, so I would have to speak about perhaps Philippine policies and legislation. I'm a Philippine senator, and I authored 2 of many environmental laws, but perhaps one could be very relevant to today's gathering today. And as chair of the Climate Change and Environment Committees, we have in the Philippine Senate authored the Climate Change Act, which created the Commission on Climate Change. Before 2009, there was no standing committee in the Philippine Senate on climate change. Because of a Senate resolution, we were able to institutionalize the Committee on Climate Change, which I chair till now, which is my third and last term. But apart from that, in 2007, which was the beginning of my second term, we filed the Climate Change Act. It was not an easy hurdle, because at the time, Typhoon Ondoy of 2009, which was very devastating, had not happened yet. And so it was quite difficult for me to convince my colleagues then that climate change was a real and present danger, that it could be one of the biggest humanitarian challenges and national security issues of our time. But to make a long story short, we were able to pass in record time the Climate Change Act, which created the National Committee on Climate Change, National Commission on Climate Change, chaired by the President, no less, with 3 commissioners. At the same time, we were also instrumental in the passage of the NDREAM-C. That's a National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Law, which created the NDREAM-C Council, which means that every city and municipality or local government unit in the Philippines must have a DRR officer or a disaster risk reduction officer. So between the Climate Change Act, which created the Commission on Climate Change, and the NDREAM-C law, which created the position of DRR officer in every local government unit, we hope that the marriage between climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, or what I would like to call now as resilience, should be able to save more lives, to be able to lessen, if not totally eliminate, if it's possible at all, agricultural losses, and to make sure that we are climate adaptive and that we have a resilient economy. What do I mean? In 2009, when Typhoon Ondoy happened, that was in the last quarter, the World Bank estimated that it had to take, if I'm not mistaken, 2.7% of our GDP, or $4 billion, to be able to rehabilitate or reconstruct after Typhoon Ondoy. We are certain that 4 years thereafter to the present, the Philippine government was incapable of having to come up with that amount, whether through the General Appropriations Act or through funds from other sources. But even before we could come up with the complete and total rehabilitation from Typhoon Ondoy, more typhoons and habagats. Habagat means no typhoon, but there's rains coming, which brings about floods and all the problems that come about with floods. And then we have, as you know, we have 20 typhoons a year. Then Typhoon Sendong happened in northern Mindanao. And then Typhoon Pablo happened in Region 11, Compostela Valley and Davao areas. Then Habagat happened. So if there was Ondoy, which had an adverse impact of 2.7% of GDP, we had Habagat 2 years ago, which has a 0.8% of GDP. And I can go on and on. That is the total economic impact of climate change. And therefore, we cannot reverse climate change. We know that. We can only mitigate it. But if we are prepared, and here's the MMDA chair who will speak later on, all of us, we know that if we are prepared, if we actually heed the call of early warning systems, if we actually implement our solid waste management law and segregate garbage at source, then our esteros and canals and waterways will be freed from all the solid waste so that water can actually flow during incessant rains. If we do not allow our informal settlers to be living in vulnerable areas on top of what has to be free-flowing areas for water, like waterways and esteros, if we implement environmental laws like Solid Waste Management Law, Clean Water Act, etc., then perhaps we will be more prepared when the 20 typhoons or more come every year. And so I'm very passionate about the need for disaster preparedness. I think that a time has come, in fact, we're very much delayed in having that paradigm shift between respond, rehabilitate, and reconstruct and rescue, which is good, and which is, of course, our duty as leaders of this country and as human beings, but to be able to lessen the negative or adverse impact of these natural hazards, which inevitably turn into disasters, we must be prepared. And so my passion for disaster risk reduction and disaster preparedness and making ourselves resilient is like this. And so I welcome the opportunity to be able to speak before you here in Habitat for Humanity, because you have a big role to play in helping us build more resilient communities, to make sure that our building codes, environmental codes are actually followed so that there will be less adverse impact on our vulnerable populations. So I'm sure that there will be a chance to speak more after the opening statements. I wasn't given a time of 2 minutes. It might have gone more than that. I'm sorry. When politicians speak, sometimes we speak too long. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
It's okay, Lauren, because most men here are married, so they know what it is. May I now call on Ms. Alicia Bala, who is currently the Undersecretary of the Department of Social Welfare Development, and she's on loan now to Jakarta through the ASEAN, serving now as Deputy Secretary General of the ASEAN for ASEAN Socio-Cultural Communities. So, Alice?
Okay, thank you, Rod. Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be with you. My role as Deputy Secretary General of ASEAN is to oversee the different sector under the socio-cultural, and one of them is environment and disaster management and humanitarian assistance. And I just wanted everyone to know that ASEAN is home to more than 600 million people and has not been spared from different forms of disasters, both natural, because you see Indonesia, Philippines are in the ring of fire. And then you have also volcano eruption. So we have a number, like for example, in Indonesia and then also the Philippines. And then typhoons and floods, you name it, Thailand, Myanmar, Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And then when you talk about the natural hazards or man-made, we also have the transboundary haze pollution between member states, like for example, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei Darussalam, Thailand, and those are 4 countries. And one of the things that ASEAN has made significantly and a contribution to the world is that we have an agreement. It's an ASEAN agreement on disaster management and emergency response. And this is the first and only one legally binding instrument in the whole world. And it has been acknowledged even by UN, because each of the member states are supposed to help each other, because there are 2-fold objectives of this ASEAN agreement on disaster management and emergency response, and that is to reduce disaster losses, and secondly, it's a platform for close cooperation between and among the 10 member states. And for those that are not aware, the member states of ASEAN, we have Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Lao PDR, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. And right now, we also have a platform for coordinating efforts in case one of the member states have been affected by great scale of disaster, and that is the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance, and in short, it's called AHA Center. And this AHA Center provides information on the assets and also the capacities of the member states. They have an information dissemination unit where they have all this information available that can be shared with the member states. And they are also responsible for organizing the deployment of what we call the Emergency Response Action Team to assist the member state that would require assistance. So one of the basic principles when it comes to disaster response, the member state affected takes the first lead role. It's only when that member state asks for support and then the AHA Center becomes the focal point for coordinating the efforts. And to support this, we also have a logistical system command that is placed in Subang, Malaysia, that can mobilize resources, both non-food and food items, including equipment. Like in the case of Typhoon Pablo, AHA Center deployed generators and even mobile stockpile vans. So in short, this is how ASEAN as an institution response to disaster in the region, especially when a member state has been struck by big typhoons or flooding or the like, or any form of disaster. So in short, later on, if there are some questions, you can ask me about how ASEAN as an institution respond to disaster risk reduction and management. Thank you.
The next lady is the Chief Executive Officer and Executive Director of Rappler Inc. Philippines. She's a well-known TV personality also, having been closely associated with CNN and what station? ABS-CBN. Okay. I came from GMA. Okay. She, of course, by the way, can we just give her a greeting? It was her birthday yesterday. Can we just say happy birthday? So tonight she's inviting us all for dinner, okay? Okay, so Maria, please.
Thank you. Hello, hello, hello. Check, check. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I will talk about just 4 things, and I may run a little bit over 2 minutes, but the 4 ideas is this. Information's role in disaster. It's huge because technology has shifted it so fast right now. It's content creation, which is what everyone can do now that social media is there. Content creation, social media amplification, leading to crowdsourcing is the 3rd term, and the last term is big data. What do I mean by these 4 terms, right? First, please raise your hand if you are on Facebook or Twitter. If you're on any social media network, raise your hand. Okay, that's pretty good. 94% minimum, 94% of Filipinos are on Facebook alone. So what does this mean when we're all on Facebook? It means that things change, scale. More than 10 million photos are uploaded every hour. So the time that you're listening to us, there are 10 million more photos uploaded. We click a like button or leave a comment nearly 3 billion times a day. Let's click again. On YouTube, there are 800 million monthly users who upload over an hour of video every second. And then if you're on Twitter, the number of tweets grows around 200% a year. And by 2012, these are the last stats I have, it exceeded 400 million tweets a day. When you're talking about these numbers, you're talking big data. Now, the question is, how can you use big data to solve any of our problems? This is not a Rorschach test. This is actually the human superorganism, societies in moments in time. So this is your behavior on Twitter. So these are Twitter maps. If you look at A, that's hashtag Japan in March 2011 during the tsunami and the Fukushima reactor incident. The Japanese behaved like we Filipinos behaved on Sendong or during Ondoy. We gather and clump around hubs of information. Normally it's government, like MMDA gathers a large clump around it, becomes a huge hub and a node during times of disaster and flooding, or government, or news networks. The second one is hashtag GOP. This was gathered, pulled down. This is the American human superorganism 6 months before the US presidential elections. And if you look at that, you can see there's no better visualization of how divided Americans were between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, right? Look at C, that's hashtag Egypt. That's what a revolution looks like. This is the point when Egypt toppled a dictator. And hashtag Syria, D, are all the tweets from Syria 18 months into the rebellion against President Bashar al-Assad. The question you have is, if hashtag Syria begins to look like hashtag Egypt, can you say that a revolution has happened? Can big data be predictive? Embedded in the definition of big data is, yes, it can. Let's go to the Philippines. And it's more colorful because it's more fun in the Philippines. This is last year, day 44, the judgment day of the Corona impeachment trial. We put it on Rappler. You can zoom in. If you were tweeting during that time period, you'll see the networks you created. Why is it important to see the networks? Because each tie among each of us spreads something. It spreads an emotion or it spreads an idea. In the case of MMDA, we hope it spreads help, which is part of the reason their app works. Let me show you more.
August 26th. Hashtag Million People March started on Facebook, right? 7 days after the Facebook post, this is what happened. This is one of the first things where you can see concretely what social media can do. Let's look at what the map looks like. Do you see how different this is, hashtag Million People March, from the ones before? Because it is exactly like that rally that it created. Peer-to-peer networks, no leadership, which means it's kind of chaotic. If you were out in Luneta Park that day, people said, you know, it's exciting, but yet it was boring because there was no one program. So this is the problem with what you have when something is peer-to-peer and disorganized. You need to have some way to actually structure the narrative, structure the framework so you can come up with solutions. Let me just show you the stats very quickly from that day. This is the tipping point. If you look, this is the way things spread. In the virtual world, mirrors the real world. In the virtual world, it took 7 days from that Facebook post, but this is already that peak that you see. That peak is 30,000 tweets or Facebook posts, and that didn't happen till nearly 10 a.m. of August 26. So it peaked on social media. Where did we get the 100,000 people out there? 12 noon, 11 or 12. So again, can you tell what is happening in reality based on your behavior on social media? Yes, absolutely. There is something predictive about it. So let's bring this to disaster risk reduction. Next slide, please. Typhoon Bofa is what the international community called it. We called it Pablo. And these are just some of the horrific pictures from it. This was the worst disaster in 2012. This is what, next slide, this is what the UN, what OCHA did. And what they did is they basically took all the tweets. What we did in the Philippines is we organized ourselves on social media. And we said, let's use the hashtag PabloPH. And then they gave it to a man named Patrick Meyer. He heads the digital humanitarian. We're working together now on this new project called Project Agos. But what he did is he took all the tweets. OCHA gave him 12 hours to collate, geotag, and organize all the information, and the next slide, please, map it. And you can map it. And he did it in 12 hours. The problem, of course, then is that now you have bottom-up civic engagement in a semi-organized way, but how do you have that meet top-down management? And that's what we're trying to do now in Project Agos. It's a bit ambitious, but we're working with several of the institutions who are dealing with this problem, from Climate Change Commission to OCD to Chairman Tolentino to MMDA. Let's take a look at the 3 areas where crowdsourcing can happen. Again, I only zoomed into one part. You'll see this already starting in operation, but what you can see is the crowd will come in from the bottom. And what is the crowd? They're just volunteers who are on social media. You can scrape all of that big data, which is on Twitter, Facebook. You pushed it, you can map it automatically. So that's an algorithmic-based program. Then you can have the crowd sift through it. And that's something that happened exactly like Patrick Meyer did. Once you have them sift through it, it goes into the database, already mapped. The LGUs who are in charge of responding to this, the first responders, the agencies in charge of that, then have access to that information with their own login. They can then come in and actually say, we're sending people to that clump of this group that needs help in Olongapo. Last Monday, this is what we saw happen. And then you can see this information transparently if you're one of the people looking to see private organization or an academe, a university that wants to send help. Just by looking at it, you can see a big picture idea of where you can help. And one of the things that's fascinating about the Philippines is that we have a lot of people who want to help. They just don't know how. And we haven't really organized ourselves enough to be able to do it. I'm saying now we can. And we can do it in public view, completely transparent. We need to work with private sector, public sector, and media. This is a journalist saying that. It works. We've seen it work in small doses. It's a big, hairy, audacious goal to make it all happen. We think we can get it done. Thanks.
Well, if I may add, Risa, the power of media was demonstrated 3 times. First, we had radio, when the cardinal called on the people to go to the streets, called people power. And then we had EDSA-DOS, where they used the text messaging, right? And now, social media, so the power of media. Now we go to the gentleman. I would like to call now on the chairman. You know, this person has a very difficult job, more difficult than the job of the Prime Minister of Singapore. Because we're looking at 14 million people, okay? You know, if New Yorkers have an attitude, Metro Manilans also have an attitude. And it's not easy really for the good chairman to try to instill discipline and make some sense of what's happening in Metro Manila. Metro Manila, as you all know, especially to our guests, is composed of 17 LGUs, or local government units. Actually, 16 cities and municipalities and one republic, the Republic of Makati. And, well, our good chairman is very much qualified for the job because, first of all, he was mayor of Tagaytay City, so he knows local governance. May I encourage the visitors from abroad, check out Tagaytay. It's about an hour and a half from here. Clean air, less traffic. It's more fun there, actually. He was also the president of the League of Cities of the Philippines. And really, it's no mean task to be the chairman of the Metro Manila Development Authority. Ladies and gentlemen, Chairman Francis Tolentino.
Thank you. I'd like to take this opportunity to react first to the first three presentations, which would be part of my presentation likewise. I agree with the Honorable Senator that preparedness is a vital cog in DRR scheme. She was part of the legislative initiative that eventually transformed MMDA as the head of the MDRIMC, Metro Manila Disaster Risk Management Council, with unfortunately yours truly as the head. I agree likewise with the statement made by the ambassador that there should be a broader regional group that would oversee all of this, considering this is not just endemic to the Philippines. For instance, seated in front of me is the former ambassador to Germany. There's a German Flood Act, which emanated from an EU Parliament directive. So perhaps the ASEAN can have flood directives that would trickle down to the 10 member countries. And I agree likewise with the statement by Ms. Reza that technology would play a vital role, especially during the golden hour. The golden hour is the immediate hour after a calamity. That's where you either save lives or retrieve cadavers. Going back to the MMDA's role, I think what is often overlooked is the role of spatial planning. It has to be part. Disaster risk mitigation should not be focused on the subject of flood risk management or event management alone, or even earthquake management. We have to go before and beyond. Before would entail the preparedness, the planning process, which would entail probably the revisiting of our existing land use plans, zoning ordinances, including the current mantra of the World Bank right now, which is retrofitting. Retrofitting buildings for possible earthquakes or even flood-proofing of buildings. If I may share this with you, the cost of a school building in the Philippines is equivalent, one classroom is equivalent to retrofitting 6 to 7 classrooms, and that would save lives. And then we go beyond, and that would entail the rehabilitation phase. It would entail resources, and resources should not be left alone to the government. Private sector should help. It has been said, the last time our agency made contact with cadavers was last week. We were able to retrieve the last body in Subic, Zambales. I personally supervise the retrieval of 19 cadavers in New Bataan, Compostela Valley. After the third, the fourth retrieval, it became just a routinary retrieval process. I asked the staff, I asked the army soldiers that we pray first before we place the body in a body bag. But after the third and the fourth, it became so normal that I cannot describe the scenario. So for me, the entire process should involve the grassroots. It has to be to the community. We cannot rely alone on heroics. We cannot rely alone on compassion and acts of mercy after an event. It has been said that foreigners, there are lots of foreigners here, would always admire the compassion of Filipinos, how we rise up again and again because of our quality of mercy. But it has been said also that the Filipinos' quality of mercy should be reinforced by merciless efficiency. And we can do that. We can do that if we have manual of operations, we have good plans, and we have DRRM embedded in our land use planning systems. Good afternoon.
We have the Senior Director for Global Disaster Response of Habitat for Humanity International, US. Mr. Kip Scheidler has 20 years of experience with Habitat, including having positions in El Salvador and Guatemala. He is one man who has seen the effects of so many disasters in many countries. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Kip Scheidler.
Good afternoon, and thank you. The question put before us is how can we increase efficiencies and increase the impact of the disaster risk reduction work we do? And I'm going to attempt to answer that from the point of view of an NGO. I think NGOs have a key role to play in this process. First, before I jump into this, how many people in the room, raise your hand if you work with a community-based organization or an NGO or a church group or civil society? If you work with any of those. Fantastic. And keep your hand up if you don't work for Habitat for Humanity. How many of you work for another agency? Yeah? There's quite a few of you. It takes all of us. We've heard Habitat's name quite a bit over yesterday and today, and some of those of us from Habitat have felt a little uncomfortable because it's as if we're asking people to talk about us, and we don't want to. So I just want to recognize that it's a lot of NGOs that are represented in this room, and the work that needs to be done will be done by all of us together, collectively. But there are two things that I think we need to focus on. The first thing is helping connect the policy work that's happening on a high level, whether it's regional or national, with what actually needs to happen on the ground in the communities. I think we can help bridge that gap. And then also help with the actual implementation on the ground. That bridging the gap is going to take advocacy work on behalf of the NGOs, working with the policymakers. There's a group, the Global Network of Civil Society for Disaster Reduction, GNDR, which Habitat isn't a part of, but they have an initiative called Views from the Front Line. And they have civil society organizations in 57 countries in the grassroots level who are monitoring compliance by government against what they've agreed to do with the Hyogo framework. So you have the grassroots watching their government and giving feedback as to whether they feel in the communities the progress is being made. And Habitat's engaged in that process in a few different countries, and I think that's a key place where we can play, where we can have an active role. Why is it so important to listen to the people in the communities? Over 50% of the affected people from disasters caused by natural hazards live in fragile or conflict countries. 95% of the people that are killed by disasters are from developing countries. 95%. And we know that the majority of disaster losses are due actually to the small-scale disasters. Not the big ones, but the small, the flooding that happens week after week, day after day in all of our countries. And we know that women and children and the elderly are the most affected and the least capable of responding to that shock in their life. And all of this is happening in the communities. We had a breakout session yesterday, and there was a question if anybody in the room was from the Philippines, and a lot of hands went up. And then the question was, were any of you Filipinos affected by Sindong? And a hand went up. And the question was, how were you affected? And the gentleman said, my house was flooded. And they said, well, did you have any losses? And he said, well, you know, it's a two-story house. We were able to go upstairs, but everything downstairs was lost. And the question was, well, what was lost? Well, my refrigerator, my television, the furniture, my stove. And then the question was, who helped you replace all of that? And the answer was nobody. And quite often, and most often, the majority of the people carrying the burden of these disasters are the poor, are the people in the communities who just have to get over the shock. They have to absorb it. They have to move on. And they do. They do. But that's why they deserve a voice in this process. And that's where I think NGOs can play a really important role. The other thing I would say is, and I would just finish that by saying community resilience is the backbone of national resilience. A nation isn't resilient if the communities aren't resilient. And that's where we work. That's where all of the NGOs and church groups in this room are working. And that's why I feel we have a very, very vital role to play in increasing the impact of the DRR work that's being done by all the different players. And then the second thing I would say, so it's bridging that gap, and the second thing is simply mainstreaming disaster risk reduction. We don't have time for it to be an add-on project. We don't have time for it to be something that we might do if we get some additional funding. All the different work that NGOs are doing, whether it's with women and children, it's health, it's shelter, it's settlements, education, all of that we need to be talking disaster risk reduction. When we're talking with children, when we're talking with mothers, when we're talking in livelihoods projects, we need to be talking about disaster risk reduction. And that's something that we can do every single day. And that's something that isn't going to cost us a lot of money to add on and just incorporate into what we're already doing. So those are the two things, bridging the gap and mainstreaming DRR.
Thank you. Last but not least, we have this young fellow. He is actually the chief executive of Mercy Relief Singapore, and it is a non-governmental humanitarian organization providing assistance to disaster-stricken communities across 23 Asian countries. As we all know, Mercy Relief also manages long-term development projects such as water, sanitation, shelter, sustainable livelihoods, healthcare, and education. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Hassan Ahmad.
Testing. A very good afternoon to everyone, and also a very big thank you to the Habitat for Humanity for inviting Mercy Relief for this forum. We're just 10 years old this year. We started in 2003, and we were launched by then Deputy Prime Minister, and now who is the Prime Minister, who's not as busy as our Chairman MMDA, as what Rod said. He's the Prime Minister of Singapore now. Mercy Relief started as, today we are a relief and development organization. Why? Because when we first started 10 years ago, as the name suggests, that Mercy Relief is an extend through relief work. And along the way, we realized after responding to major disasters like the Asian tsunami, the Muzaffarabad earthquake, some armed conflict in Sri Lanka, we realized that just what Senator Leganda said earlier, nothing beats preparedness. It's not about being reactive, you know, we have to be proactive. And in 2008, that was where we actually put our resources into development focus and emphasis also to ensure that we build the capacity of poverty-stricken or impoverished communities to enhance, to lift up to, their capabilities, not just for better lives, but also to better respond to disaster should it hit them. So we identified disaster communities over 5 countries in Southeast Asia. Of course, the two big naturally Philippines and Indonesia would be included because they are the hypermarts and the supermarkets of disasters. And so henceforth, thereafter we focus further into DRRM, and this is where we feel that both for preparedness and response, it needs greater coordination in the region. A lot of times typhoons passes through 2 or 3 countries at one go. The latest Wutip, that goes to China, passing by Zambales. And Mercy Relief has worked in Philippines since Morocco in 2009, thereafter Ondoy or Quetzana, and then Washi, and then Bofa or Pablo. We also have development works which includes DRRM components in Zambales. We work in Baseco in Manila. Across to the east, we actually work in Bicol for some DRRM projects. And we feel that all of these works that we do needs to be coordinated, whether it's for DRRM or for the response itself. We are extremely optimistic, especially after ASEAN in June this year, where ASEAN passed, the foreign ministers passed the ACDM or the ASEAN Committee for Disaster Management to partner representatives, CSOs, representing the 10 ASEAN member states. This is to have a better bridge, or partnership, or more concerted effort, in addressing preparedness and also response. And I think the next level it would be to bring in the private sector, where largely the assets are largely within the domain of the private sector. And I think without resources, ACDM or the CSOs, will not be able to do much, because concepts will remain concept unless resources are pumped in to bring those concepts to the next level, which is the implementation, right? So I think this is where also I feel with regards to coordination, international organizations like OCHA, I think needs to, we are anticipating, or at least we expect OCHA to take a more active role in leading the sector of DRRM and preparedness and response within the region of ASEAN and also Asia, right? So with that, I thank you.
Okay, we now come to the question and answers. Let me first start. First, may I ask all of you, and you may answer. You may answer accordingly. How would you redefine the role of your institution in addressing the challenges of disaster risk reduction and management? Right now, your institutions are in place, but there could still be room for improvement. So how would you redefine it? And if so, what kind of support do you require from, well, there are 3 Ps, right? The public, the private sector, and the people. What kind of support will you need from these 3 factors of the equation? Anybody, please? Senator?
Maybe I can start as a legislator. While the laws that I mentioned, the Climate Change Act and the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Law, have been commended by no less than the United Nations, Assistant Secretary General Margareta Wallström of the UNISDR, as the best laws in the world, which has been used as a model for other countries. It should not stop there, and the challenge for all of us is to be able to make these laws work without the cooperation of the private sector, the local government units, the MMDA, the DENR, the DPWH, the media, the citizens themselves. Then all the well-crafted laws and policies that we institutionalize would be useless. And so, first, to be able to implement these laws, we must make sure that the citizens are aware that these laws actually exist. Second, that they're actually funded by the Department of Budget and Management, and the funds must be utilized efficiently and effectively and of course monitored, etc., to make sure that these actually go to the communities and are utilized for such purpose. And third, so that the funding that we put every year don't just go back into rehabilitation. In a climate change hearing for their budget the other day, Vice Chair Sering said that yes, our budget for flood control has actually increased 1,000-fold. I'm not sure with regards to the numbers, but it goes to rehabilitation, meaning that perhaps the flood control infrastructure has to be fixed, retrofitted, improved, but it does not mean that we are doing new flood control infrastructure to protect vulnerable communities. And so the challenge for all of us is really to make sure that our laws work to protect the vulnerable communities. And this is really a big, big challenge. And we can only see this if when the hazards come, typhoons, for example, and because of the typhoons, there will be floods. If there would be zero casualty, if there will be less negative impact or less economic and agricultural losses, we can only measure the effective implementation of our laws if these numbers actually improve in the days or months to come. So laws are useless unless they're implemented by the executive, and the executive cannot be blamed completely because it takes the citizens to be able to help us implement these laws.
Chairman, would you care to comment, please, on how in the area of governance you can instill?
Yes, I agree with the salient points raised by the good senator. In fact, she was asking me a while ago, how would you delineate your function with that of DPWH? Sabi ko kanina, DPWH performs the infra side. We take over maintenance, etc., but with no funds and personnel. So I was thinking, related to your question on how to improve the functions of our agency, and the good senator might be interested to craft a legislative proposal. We have 897 kilometers of drainage laterals and mains within Metro Manila. Some circa 1930s. Some are being maintained by MMDA, most are being maintained by DPWH, some are being maintained by city government, some are being maintained and operated by private villages and subdivisions. Do you see the disconnect? 897 kilometers being maintained and operated by different entities. In Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region has one department. It's called the Department of Drainage. Department of Drainage. If the good senator would accept the idea, we should have a Bureau of Drainage just for the Metro Manila area. Just one entity to maintain, and probably interlink this with the current concessionaire agreements with the water utilities, which they might be able to utilize some of the runoff water to serve as future potable water for the 12 million residents. So some legislative proposals are probably imperative right now. We have to delineate the functions and pursue that, what I mentioned a while ago, merciless efficiency.
If I may, this is not part of the format. I'm glad that the Secretary mentioned that the 897, I wonder if they're all readily available as free-flowing drainage and waterways, or which percentage of the 897 have actually been already occupied by informal settlers?
So probably just by going out.
Tell me 50%. Oh, that's causing the
going out of this hotel, you'll reach the Don Bosco area. There are diggings there. You have portions of Buendia. There are diggings there. You have portions of Rizal Avenue in Manila. There are diggings there. So right now we have 76 ongoing drainage upgrade programs. So 897, there are disconnects. Floods would eventually go to the street level and eventually damage properties, cause traffic jam, etc., including the economy.
But of this 897, which are populated by informal settlers?
I am not so sure of informal settlement populations within the drainage systems, but out of our 237 esteros, 55% are not accessible utilizing MMDA equipment or even MMDA personnel because they are thickly populated.
Oh, the
55%.
esteros, the 230 esteros is different from this 897
Yes, ma'am.
drainage.
Yes, ma'am.
So we're talking about waterways here in general, whether they are drainages or esteros. And imagine 55% of the 230 esteros are populated.
Yes,
That is the answer to the flooding of Metro Manila.
And the
Kung
traffic.
walang dadaluyan ang tubig, kalahati ng dapat daluyan ng tubig ay may tao, yun
Yes.
ang dahilan.
Yes.
I'm speaking in Tagalog. It means if the waterways are already populated by informal settlers, there goes the answer to the flooding problem. So they must be relocated. Now, whose responsibility is it to relocate those people living on what used to be waterways?
It's actually we have right now an interagency initiative, the DILG, MMDA, the SWD, DPWH, including the National Housing Authority. Our first priority is to have the 8 major waterways cleared by December of 19,440 families. So you're speaking of San Juan River, Tullahan River, portions of Pasig River, amongst others. But to cover the 55% of the 237, it would take years.
And these are very vulnerable populations. It's for their own good that we relocate them ASAP because they live in vulnerable areas hazard areas when rains come.
Yes.
These are the first that would flood.
Yes.
They can die. It's unhealthy.
Yes. And they affect the entire adjoining communities.
Let me coordinate with your office, and I want to be the author of the bill that would create an agency, whichever you call it, a bureau, or make it under the MMDA to manage the drainage, 897 drainage. But then again, legislation is one thing, but having it implemented is another. But let me be part of the solution and let this habitat event be part of the solution. The suggestion of Chair
Very good, very
Francis.
good. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Maria, you want to say something?
I think I enjoyed that. I think that I've covered disasters in Southeast Asia for almost 30 years, and I think we all recognize something really changed in 2009. And when Ondoy happened, it was drastically different, and now every time it rains, I get scared. And that's also something really new. We don't know, it used to be predictable. It's now no longer predictable. And I think the key thing, and it should be not just for our institution, but almost everyone now, we are seeing this. The time to sit back and wait for other people to do something is actually over. And I think that's part of what we heard in their exchange. Some things require political will. If the political will isn't there, do we just sit back? Because we're all going to be affected by it. So for us in Rappler, well, Rappler is not a traditional journalist organization, so we've thrown that away and we've decided that the word I used yesterday was enlightened self-interest. It is to all of our benefits for us to do something now in our area of influence. We cannot wait for just MMDA or for the law, and we do have good laws, but they're not implemented. So what happens next? It is no longer business as usual. We need to lean in. We need to do whatever we can in our area of influence.
May I hear from Alice?
There is an estimation that the average on an annual basis, the losses in ASEAN region is $4.4 billion. And so therefore, ASEAN right now is saying that investment in disaster should be viewed as a very good investment, because for every dollar investment of $1, you will be able to prevent $4 to $7 losses. And so therefore, the ASEAN Committee on Disaster Management, this is the sectoral body that is responsible for the implementation of the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, has tied up with the insurance and finance sectors of ASEAN, and they came up now with disaster risk financing and insurance roadmap. And this is being discussed now, and this is where ASEAN is also putting its attention and advocacy to ensure that ASEAN should be able to cope and should be prepared in responding to or preventing or mitigating disaster in the region. So I think this is where, and what is the needed resources? In November, there will be a partners forum that will be managed by ASEAN, and it will be held in Hanoi. If you're interested, just let me know, and you will get invitation to that event, because we thought that partnership not only among ASEAN member states, but it should become inclusive, meaning the people, the financing institutions, the CSOs, even the media. But right now we have five members, what we call it the ASEAN Partners Group. These are all international organizations, and we want to expand that network so that we can have a better response to disaster mitigation, rescue, rehabilitation, and even especially capacity building for the local communities. So we're just about 2 years away from our target of one vision, one identity, and one community, and that's ASEAN Community by 2015. Thank you very much.
I was just going to say, related to relocating the informal settlements along the waterways, there's an aggressive plan here in Metro Manila that actually gave a presentation on it in Washington about a month ago, which was odd for me to do that. But it's impressive. It really is an impressive plan. And there's money, there's capital, there's political will. The challenging thing is finding land that is in good proximity to where the livelihoods are of those families, so that they have somewhere viable to go. Otherwise, and we've seen this in other countries, and unfortunately Habitat actually has committed this sin, is building, relocating families where there isn't a livelihood, and they just go back. They'll be right back in those waterways, even though something else is built, if there isn't a good livelihoods option, or if they aren't close enough to where their livelihoods are. So I think someone said it earlier, we know how to do it. And a wonderful thing here in the Philippines is there's the political will, and there's actually the money to do it. But there are a couple of pieces to the puzzle that are being really hard to get into place. So I think we just need, as you said, Maria, just lean into it. I think we need a few more people to lean into that issue, and I think we can fix it, and we can find a solution for those families that are living in the waterways now.
I think we all quite know our roles in DRRM, whether it's at the government and public sector, or the private sector, or the NGO and the CSO sector. What is also important, I think, that due to limited resources, I think we must not go into other people's roles, duplicate efforts, and this will lead to wastage of resources, already limited resources. So knowing our roles is one thing, not going into other people's roles, of course, if they are not doing it already, but I think this is where over the last decade, more than a decade, we saw in many places in different countries, whether it's in Japan or it's in Pakistan, in South Asia, East Asia, and we realized that a lot of times there were duplication of efforts, which actually leads to not just wastage of resources, but also chaos. Because if you look at the Tokyo airport, you look at in Subang, in the port in Aceh, right? We are actually adding burden to the already burdened situation on the ground. So I think it's very important for us to know what our roles are and other people's roles, so that we won't trip onto each other. Thanks.
Thank you. May we invite now our friends to ask a question? Yes, please. Identify yourself.
Danny Madlansakay, Mega World Corporation. Well, actually, the only thing that bothers each one of us is the problem. This problem has been going on for the last 30 years, especially the flooding in Metro Manila. I have heard so many forums already to prevent it. I know we have good reaction team all over the Philippines, but that is not so important if we are not going to prevent what is going to happen again. For 30 years, the same areas has been flooding for 30 years. What are we going to do with that? We have so many plans, we are going to have so many laws that must provide for all of this. But we have this already for the last 20 years. For the reason that the same canals, the same steros, the same problem with people staying in that areas. What are we going to do? That is the only problem that causes us so many sleepless nights.
You want to comment, Mr. Chairman?
I agree that same recurring problem for the last several decades. I agree. Likewise, that same areas are being flooded. Even during my high school days, same areas. But I think what's really different now, and I'm really a prisoner of hope, is that for the first time, we will be, and we are now, and we have relocated informal settlers. We started in San Juan. It has not been done before, even as earlier espoused by the late Mayor Arsenio Lacson of Manila during his incumbency. They have never been relocated. We're doing it now. We're starting it now. And I think what would set us dramatically different from the previous years that we have the resolve, we have the technology in place, but it has never been said that Metro Manila can be flood prone. To make it flood resilient is to recognize that Marikina is a floodplains area, to recognize that Kamanava is below sea level, Navotas, the city of Manila, etc. To recognize that we only have 3 meters of Laguna de Bay that would continuously inundate Muntinlupa, Pateros, and Taguig. But the reality right now is that people have come to realize that their safety lies in their hands. So I think it's not just us dreaming of having a flood-free metro. It's us pursuing, as what the good senator said, a more resilient Metro Manila. I've mentioned flood retroofing of school buildings and hospitals. You have, for instance, UARM in VMAPA, in Santa Mesa. It can be done. I earlier proposed the utilization of the San Juan River as an alternative to EDSA. I heard a while ago a proposal to revitalize the Pasig River Ferry. So I think the difference is that we are starting something new. And it has now been translated into a component of the local planning process. But if I may refer to the first question raised a while ago, my dream is to have just one Metro Manila comprehensive land use plan. Unless we can have that, we may never be able to address all the other adjoining issues, like, for instance, the existing 10% open space that we have right now for Metro Manila that would no longer be able to capture the runoff water. You call it stochastic occurrences that are not predictable. You have condominiums, high-rise buildings proliferating, even along EDSA. So we have to have that. And I think it would emanate from the now pending in Congress National Land Use Plan. But I agree, it has been flooding ever since in España, 70s, 2 weeks before it subsides, but I think right now, siguro 3 hours na lang, it subsides. We never promised that we would be flood-free, but to make the community more resilient is perhaps the best answer to your current worry.
Well, friends, I must apologize. Yes, Lauren, please. You want to friends, I'm sorry, but we'll have to close this. I was mercilessly told by Kate Maceda that we should end up now. So anyway, let me just recap what our panelists have said. The good senator reminds us that we cannot reverse climate change. We just need to be prepared and be prepared to save lives. I think that's the utmost goal. Yusek Bala says that investment in disaster risk and reduction will be made available and should be encouraged, and that mobilizing resources would be a prudent way of addressing the problem. Journalist, if I may call you journalist, Madam Journalist Maria Ressa, of course, underscores the importance of data made available in quantity and quality terms by the social network. And of course, her concern is about the information from down to top, but now it should also transcend from top to down. Chairman Tolentino, of course, again reminds us of preparedness. She had something which I think is very, very important. Safety lies in your hands. It lies in our hands. So I guess that's the key message. And I agree with him, being a resident of San Juan, that there ought to be a Metro Manila comprehensive plan. Kip Scheider mentioned about his concerns about the proximity of land, of the site where the informal dwellers will be located. It must be near the source of livelihood, or else it defeats the purpose. Right? And of course, Asan Ahmad mentions about the need for coordination to avoid waste and chaos, because that can happen really. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a very fruitful, I would say, and engaging session. But before we end, I understand that Senator Lagarda has something to offer us, aside from offering to pass a law, that would create the Bureau of Drainage. Wow. Okay, you want answering? Well, the free lover that she is.
Francis and I were talking, so thank you for that, Rod. I wanted to react to the gentleman's interjection earlier. Yes, we all agree in this room. It's so exasperating and frustrating because it's not a new problem. We've had this for many decades. The only two things I can think of are different now. Of course, we have a bigger population now. And the sorry thing about it is it's a collective problem. We allowed this, the increase in population, the people, to build their structures on what should not have been built on, namely waterways, esteros. Hindi dapat inalagyan ng bahay doon o structure, pero yun. Pero nandyan na yun. On the other hand, the good news is there are laws in place now. 30 years ago, there was no climate change law. 30 years ago, there was no NDREAM-C law. And we now have the personnel, the government officers who are accountable, and we now have people aware of this. So hopefully, with the new laws, which are only 3 years old, even with a burgeoning population and with the violations of the law by structures being allowed to be built on waterways, hopefully with many people helping out, not just people in government and the executive, but everybody helping out, we can surmount these problems, but not overnight. It really has to take the political will and everybody's cooperation. Ang hihingin ko lang po sa inyong lahat, at tatagalogin ko ito dahil hindi naman sakop ito ng ating mga dayuhan. Ipatupad po natin ang Republic Act 9003 o ang Ecological Solid Waste Management Law. Ang paghihiwalay ng basura sa nabubulok at hindi nabubulok. Segregation of garbage at source, recycle at compost. After you leave your conference, find out in your home, I learned so much from the conference, but am I actually segregating garbage at source? Am I recycling? Am I composting? Am I separating the paper from the food waste, from the plastics and the metals, etc.? If you're not doing that, then do it soon. If your barangay or your subdivision or your village of your city or your municipality is not doing it, urge your LGU, your local mayor, to do it. Otherwise, mount a campaign on Facebook, on Rappler, that it's not being implemented because that law was enacted into law in my first term, January of 2001. If it's not being implemented, then that's something to act on. I know we act on many things. We'll have to do many things on social media. Instead of destroying each other, let's make sure that we make sure the laws are implemented and encourage everyone to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Well said. Well, before we turn over to Sidling, let me just end the session with a beautiful reminder from Charles Swindoll. If you know him, Charles Swindoll. He said, and Chairman, please listen to this because this can also reinforce your belief in being a hopelessly, we'll call that your eternal hope. No? We are all faced with a series of great opportunities, brilliantly disguised as impossible situations. So on that note, thank you very much, and maybe we cast now